remember that the chapter We Agnostics was written by Bill Wilson, and although there's some stuff in here that Bill wrote that he didn't write with it, like the chapter 2, the wives. He wrote that chapter as if it was coming from a wife, and obviously it wasn't. It was coming from Bill. But this chapter, We Agnostics, was written by a man who was an agnostic. Bill Wilson didn't know whether there was a God or not when he had met Ebby Thatcher. His quote was, "That statement hit me hard." His friend Ebby Thatcher said to him, "Why don't you develop your own conception of God? You don't have to subscribe to someone else's idea of God. You can come up with your own idea." And he said that statement hit him hard, that it had melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow he had stood and shivered for many years. And this chapter has the word God in it. I don't know, but at least 40 times. So I've heard people make, the reason I say that, because I've heard people make reference to the fact that you don't need to swallow the idea of God just yet. But then there's step 3 says, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of this God. We're right in the middle of the page here on 53 where this is what I've come to know as the test for the second step. And when I read the other literature, like Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, AA Comes of Age, Pass It On, and you see any reference to the first 3 steps in there, that the reference that I came across was that most of the time they just sat down and asked you, do you want to stop drinking? And if you said, yes, I want to stop drinking, that was step 1. You had done step 1. And if you said, they would say to you, do you believe in God? And most people would, roughly 50% of the people would say yes, and that would have been step 2. And this is the question of the second step, the test for the second step, right in the middle of the page here. And remember that this chapter was written with the idea behind it that 50% of the first 100 alcoholics were of atheist or agnostic temperament, as he wrote, and they became converts. Now they believe that there is a power greater than themselves. Not that they got sober without a power greater than themselves. And the reason I bring that up is because I've heard in many meetings over the years people make a reference to this chapter saying that you don't need God to get sober. Go to the chapter We Agnostics and you'll see. And that's not what this chapter says. This chapter says we became converts. Now we believe that there's something there. Well, we don't know what it is, but there's something there. But here he says, when we became alcoholics crushed by a self-imposed crisis. And this I've come to know as the second step, the test for the second step. A self-imposed crisis we could not postpone or evade, and that would be along the lines of like jail, divorce, unemployment, homelessness, liver failure, something bad. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What's our choice to be? This is an absolute. There's no, well, maybe, there is no middle of the road there. However, when you come across people who don't know whether they believe, it is instructed to tell them just to go on with the rest of the steps. And it's not like we have to stop here and now we can't go on until you say, yes, you believe. It's, anyway, this next paragraph here has this phrase that I've come to be so fond of over the years of this bridge of reason. And to me, this was a very important thing for me in my life. I'm just going to speak for about the first 30 minutes and we'll open up the floor. I'll give each person about 2 or 3 minutes to speak. About 9 o'clock, I'll open up the floor for open discussion. This next paragraph here, it brings up the idea of this bridge of reason trying to lead me to the land of faith in God, that somehow intellectually I can find my way to God just by thinking my way or it taking place solely in my head. And the reference that he's making here is that just like we do here, in the front of the desk here, it says faith without works is dead, that no amount of this reason will bring me to faith. It must be brought about through my action. Step 12 is the action that we talk of that brings faith in God. And you'll see in this paragraph where he makes a reference to that he had been over the bridge of reason many a times, but it just doesn't go far enough. The bridge of reason will not lead you to the land of faith. You must take the leap and do this life of sacrifice for others in order to receive what it is they say you're going to get. He says, arrived at this point, we were squarely confronted with the question of faith. We couldn't duck the issue. Some of us had already walked far over the bridge of reason toward the desired shore of faith. The outlines of the promise of the new land had brought luster to tired eyes and fresh courage to flagging spirits. Friendly hands had stretched out in welcome. We were grateful that reason had brought us so far, but somehow we couldn't quite step ashore. Perhaps we had been leaning too heavily on reason that last mile. We did not like to lose our support. That was natural, but let us think a little more closely. Without knowing it, had we not been brought to where we stood by a certain kind of faith? For did we not believe in our own reasoning? Did we not have confidence in our ability to think? What was that but a sort of faith? Yes, we had been faithful, objectively faithful to the God of reason. So in one way or another, we discovered that faith had been involved all the time. We found, too, that we had been worshippers. What a state of mental gooseflesh that used to bring on. Had we not variously worshipped people, sentiment, things, money, and ourselves, and then, with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, or a flower? Who of us has not loved something or somebody? How much did these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? Little or nothing, we saw at last. Were not these things the tissue out of which our lives were constructed? Did not these feelings, after all, determine the course of our existence? It was impossible to say we had no capacity for faith or love or worship. In one form or another, we have been living by faith and little else. Imagine life without faith, where nothing left but pure reason. It wouldn't be life. But we believed in life, of course we did. We could not prove life in the sense that you can prove a straight line as the shortest distance between 2 points, yet there it was. Could we still say the whole thing was nothing but a mass of electrons created out of nothing, meaning nothing, whirling to a destiny of nothingness? Of course we couldn't. The electrons themselves seemed more intelligent than that. At least so the chemists said. Hence we saw that reason isn't everything. Neither is reason, as most of us use it, entirely dependable, though it emanate from the best minds. What about people who prove that man could never fly? One of the things that you can see here that he's trying to do is dispel the idea that science can bring us to God. That one of the things that we're going to be burning into our head later on into these steps is that the action of the 12 steps must manifest in our lives. The people that you see falling around you that don't stay sober are the people that do not help other people through the 12 steps. That the 12 steps has a certain added benefit, that there's life of service to others outside of AA, and it's going on all around us, but it's not keeping people sober. That I've heard a lot of people come in here and say they've been to the church and it worked for a while, but then it eventually failed them. And that they've been to the doctors and that it worked for a while, but it eventually failed them. But here in Alcoholics Anonymous, we have a certain activity that we perform, which is to work with others through the 12 steps. And when we get later on in the steps, I'll try to go into some of the details as I understand it of the benefits of that, which essentially are humility and ego deflation. The certain humility of an acknowledgement that there is a God and I'm not it, by bringing others to this God is the most pure form of ego deflation that we have, and that's why we use this in Alcoholics Anonymous. Yet we had been seeing another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation from this world. People who rose above their problems. They said God made these things possible. And we only smiled. We hadn't seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves it wasn't true. Or we had seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves it wasn't true. Now this paragraph here is the paragraph that I've got highlighted as being the paragraph as a statement of fact that these people, and if you go back to the first page of this chapter, we agnostics, he says roughly 50% of the first 100 alcoholics, so that's like 50 out of every 100 are either atheists or agnostic. They don't know, or they say there is no God. And this is a statement that these, as Bill wrote it himself, that they became converts, that there was some idea of God in their head, and they have it. He says here, actually, we were fooling ourselves. For deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or other it's there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup. just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we have to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found, and it was so with us. So that one paragraph, or that two paragraphs right there, is a solid statement that these people now believe that there is something. It was only there that he may be found. It was so with us. Now, the reason I said that, because over the years I have heard people make a reference to this chapter as being the chapter that states that you don't need. And there's a couple of stories in the back there, too, that the people who want to fight the God idea will tell you, go back to this story in the back here. This guy says he got sober without God. Read this chapter. Fighting it, just like I did. I fought it, too, and I bounced in and out for a couple of years fighting it. We can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then, if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. In this book, you will read the experience of a man who thought he was an atheist. His story is so interesting that some of it should be told now. His change of heart was dramatic, convincing, and moving. Now, this isn't Bill's story. I think this is one of those stories in the back. Somebody had mentioned to me that this is Bill Dobson, which is AA number 3, that third guy that got sober. Our friend was a minister's son. He attended church school, where he became rebellious at what he thought an overdose of religious education. For years thereafter, he was dogged by trouble and frustration, business failure, insanity, fatal illness, suicide. These calamities in his immediate family embittered and depressed him. Post-war disillusionment, ever more serious alcoholism, impending mental and physical collapse brought him to the point of self-destruction. One night, when confined to a hospital, he was approached by an alcoholic who had known a spiritual experience. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, "If there is a God, he certainly hasn't done anything for me." But later, alone in his room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I have known are wrong? While pondering the answer, he felt as though he had lived in a hell. Then, like a thunderbolt, a great thought came. It crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? This man recounts that he tumbled out of bed to his knees. In a few seconds, he was overwhelmed by the conviction of the presence of God. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. The barriers he had built through the years were swept away. He stood in the presence of infinite power and loved. He stepped from the bridge to shore for the first time. He lived in conscious companionship with his Creator. Thus, our friend's cornerstone fixed in place. No later vicissitude has shaken it. His alcoholic problem was taken away that very night years ago. It disappeared. Save for a few brief moments of temptation, the thought of drink has never returned. And at such times a great revulsion has risen up in him. Seemingly he could not even drink if he would. God had restored his sanity. And now that's a reference to, when you're talking about sanity versus insanity and Alcoholics Anonymous, I like to use the analogy of, I've never heard of a psychiatrist prescribing 12 steps of recovery to someone who's got, some kind of antisocial behavior or some kind of true mental illness. A truly mentally ill person, these 12 steps will not help you. And many people come in here and they make a reference to, my life's getting insane again, so I thought I'd come back to a meeting. When that's not the insanity that we speak of in AA. We're talking about how you react to the first drink. Knowing that drink has devastated me over and over again, has taken me to jail. I've lost everything repeatedly. A number of times I've gotten up to get things back and then crashed down again. And it all boiled down to, do you want that first drink, yes or no? And to say, yes, I want that first drink is insanity. And that's the insanity that we deal with here in Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't deal with screaming and yelling at other people. I mean, we do have a way of doing an inventory to get rid of anger and fear and guilt, the three things that we say block us mostly from a life of service for others. But essentially, the true insanity that people may be speaking of like, I don't know, what would be manic depressive? I mean, Bill has a chapter that he wrote in this other book about his deep depression and how he battled it for 15 years. But anyway, when we write that God has restored us to sanity, we're talking about how we react to the first drink. There's no situation that I've come across in the 20 years that I've been sober has ever made me even contemplate. I run across a buddy of mine some years back, and he says, man, I was dropping the wife off at the airport so she could go home, and I was coming home from the airport, and I thought, oh, man, I stopped to get gas in the wrong area of town, and he just shakingly came back to AA going, man, I barely made it. And I'm thinking, man, there must be something you're not doing right, because I don't do that. That doesn't happen to me. I drive through the neighborhood, and it doesn't bother me. Whatever it is that's going on, I walk through the aisle with the beer, and I don't even notice it. It might as well be hand grenades or something, as far as I know. But anyway, God had restored his sanity. And this was a story here that we're reading of the 10%. Remember, when we gave there's a statistic of roughly 10% of alcoholics receive this sudden and profound spiritual experience in which their obsession is removed that very day. And the other 90% of us have to fight tooth and nail like Dr. Bob did. Dr. Bob was, for 3 years, he said it was hand-to-hand combat. It was like he was, every morning he'd have to get up and put on his military suit and go out and battle it out with alcohol until the obsession was relieved from him. For 3 years he did this. And anyway, what is this but a miracle of healing? Yet its elements are simple. Circumstances made him willing to believe. He humbly offered himself to his Maker, then he knew. Even so has God restored us all to our right minds. To this man the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly. And that the statistic is, I don't remember where it's at, but it's 90% a gradually educated variety of spiritual experience, and 10% of the sudden and profound release from that obsession. But he has come to all who have honestly sought him. That's one of the things. I work with a lot of people who, literally struggling for 8, 10, 12 years of bouncing in and out of recovery and asking me, hey, you know a little bit about the book. You've got some knowledge. I had other sponsees who didn't know what they were doing, and they come to me like I'm going to be any better than they were. But here's one of the in the chapter How It Works, we read, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. And I like to say, how many people can you say who are in chronic relapse actually go after alcoholics, this 12 steps in Alcoholics Anonymous, like their life depends upon it, like the desperation that a drowning man would be grabbing at a life preserver somebody just threw at him, That's the analogy that I like to use whenever I have these people come up to me, and I'll tell you, it's always the same thing. I relapsed again on Friday when I got paid, and the AA things, I had 3 months, 2 months, whatever, fill in the blank, And this AA thing's just not working for me, and I'm trying to find my way too. I'm trying to help people understand what it is they're going through, and I know that I see a lot of people in the past drop people for when you drank, you're fired. A sponsor. I don't. I say, get back in here. Let's try to figure out what the hell happened, where we went wrong. It's right here in the book, somewhere along the lines here. And here where he says, some of us, but he has come to all who have honestly sought him. And where was that other one? There was another one there I was going to... Anyway, that's a pretty good analogy there. He has come to all who have honestly sought him. When I come across a lot of these people who are in chronic relapse, my question to them is, so you were to the point now, we had gotten through the 12 steps and you were doing a daily inventory. And they say, well, no, not really, but, and you were with this inventory. And if you'll read the 4th step, he keeps writing repeatedly, we turn back to that list, for it held the key to our future freedom from alcoholism. And repeatedly, like 3 or 4 times, he says that we are to turn back to that list and apply those spiritual solutions to those lists that we made. And an idea that we're going to be implementing this, like brushing your teeth every day. You don't say, well, I brushed them 6 months ago. You have to do it every single day. And that's the same answer with every person who's ever gone. I've never had anybody relapse and come back and say, well, yeah, I was doing an inventory and I had applied those spiritual solutions. I was working with others through the 12 steps and I drank anyway. It's always they drift away a little further, and somewhere along the lines, I always try to keep people around that third step, because for me, the third step was a turning point in my life. When in my head, I finally realized to flip that switch and say, well, my only reason for living from here on out then is to serve God and to do what God wants me to do. And I know it sounds creepy, but it ain't that big a deal. It means now I have to be there for the people in my life, my family, the people I work with, the people I am in AA with. That's all that means. And instead of being here to take what I can from AA, I'm here to put what I can into it. I'm here to give my time and give my experience with the 12 steps and to try to explain this to people who don't understand it. And then I'm always hearing other people say, I'm just going to the meeting to get what I can out of it, and take what you need and leave the rest and go. And that's a bad piece of advice, because that's essentially a piece of advice that is keeping you locked into the idea of selfishness that is the root cause of our alcoholism. This last little thing here. When we drew near to God, he disclosed himself to us. And that's been a pretty much... that's the experience that I've had too, that I honestly sought God in my life, because to me there was only two options, and that was to drink or this sobriety thing. There was no... I tried the controlled drinking thing, and it just didn't work. But that was my personal struggle, and I think that may be, a lot of times what we're reading in this book is the history of AA. We're reading the history... I'll give you an example. In 3 different places in this book, in the foreword to the second edition, the entire foreword is all about Bill Wilson is on the edge of a drink. He's standing outside of a bar, and there's a telephone over here. Bar, telephone. He picks up the phone. He finds a drunk to work with. It's Dr. Bob. That whole foreword to the second edition is that story. Then you read Bill's story. Most of Bill's story is about him being on the edge of a drink and finding Dr. Bob and finding somebody to work with. Huh? Bill's story, yeah. And the entire chapter of Vision for You, the whole chapter is nothing but, it's like 15 pages of the story of Bill is standing outside that bar again. He's on the edge of a drink. He's got 6 months of sobriety, and his sobriety, essentially, when you read it, you can see that his sobriety is over. It's over. He's going to drink, but no. He finds somebody to work with, and he stays sober again. And that's the birth date of Alcoholics Anonymous, by the way, when he kept Dr. Bob sober that night. But it's so simple, and it's you read it over and over, and you're like, I've heard that Bill and Bob story, but you don't understand. The Bill and Bob story is either your story or it's not. You see, you get in here and you start helping other people, and you stay sober, and you never drink again, or you get in here and you hang out and you kick your feet up and you go, I don't have to. Why do I have to work so hard at that AA thing? Here's a guy over here who's got his own business. He hits on all the women, comes in late, leaves early. You see, not everybody who comes in here is a real alcoholic. Not everybody who comes in here. We don't screen people when they walk through that door. Hey, you're not a real alcoholic, man. You got to go. Anybody that wants to stop drinking is welcome in here. But not everybody's life depends on them staying off of alcohol, and mine does. So when I see those guys coming in here and hanging out, I try to tell everybody else in the room, make sure that you notice that not everybody in here is a real alcoholic, that people can come in here and sponsor no one for a decade. They don't help anybody. They don't do any. When you ask them, what are the details of the 4th step, they go, you just make a life story. There's a brief reference to life story in step 5, but it's not. It's a search for what blocks you from God. The 3rd step was a decision to turn your life over to God. The 4th step was a search to find what blocks you from turning your life over to God. And I always put it in a reference of step 12. I always say the end result of all of these steps is step 12. It's where they're taking you. And where step 2 lies in that one, if you didn't notice, that whole chapter, We Agnostics, is step 2. With a little bit of the previous chapter, more about alcoholism, I think it was, yeah. More about alcoholism dealt with, the last 4 or 5 pages dealt with sanity versus insanity. Remember where the guy says, I thought, the thought crossed my mind I could put an ounce of whiskey in my milk and it wouldn't hurt me. What are you, freaking nuts? I mean, that's crazy. And he's got all kinds of little areas in there where these people, one minute they're normal people, and the next minute there's a drink in their hand, and they're going, what the hell happened? Where did it come from? And what we're saying in AA is there's a driving force behind that. That the idea that out of nowhere I find myself with a beer in my hand and looking around going, where the hell did that come from? I never made a conscious decision to pick up a drink, and there I stood with a drink in my hand. I had no control over it whatsoever. And we're saying in here that there's a driving force behind that. And that's what we're going to get to. And that driving force is fear. This is a faith-based recovery program on the idea that fear is the driving force behind that magical day when you wind up with a beer in your hand. And we're going to combat that fear with the program of action that we have in here. And to get there, you have to first say that, number one, step one essentially is, and you can see this in the third step. I'll take you out there real quick. The third step is on, actually, it's like most of how it works. About the first 5 pages of how it works is step 3. But this is toward the end of it here on page 62. On the bottom of page 62, he says, this is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Now, what's first of all? That's step 1. First of all, if you're going to put this God of this world between you and that first drink, you have to first see that you are not it. You are not the God of this world. You are not in control of your life. I always tell my sponsees, you don't even control your breathing or your heartbeat. That's how out of control your life is, but you just don't know it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. And now this is the idea of the 12 steps. He is the principal, and we are his agents. We must go out and sell God as the principal, as a form of ego deflation and a source of continued humility, continued ego deflation. Even the psychiatrists in the back of the book, AA Comes of Age, there's a couple of chapters in there written by the psychiatrists who Bill Wilson says were the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. We all point to Bill and go, he's the founder. Bill turns around and goes, no. The psychiatrists and the doctors and the priests, they're the founders of AA. They helped us put the 3 of those things together to come up with this one idea. And the psychiatrists say that what these alcoholics have, after studying the inner workings of the subconscious human mind, they've come up with, Alcoholics Anonymous provides us with a continued source of ego deflation. That everybody had the ability to stay off of alcohol for a couple of weeks when they got smashed by it and just completely devastated them. But eventually they would turn into that same butthole that they were before. The ego would restore itself, and I see it all. It's so clear to me today. I'm working with people, and they come in here in tears, and they're broken, and they're begging for help. 2 weeks later, they're like, F you and that AA crap. I got this thing handled, And you're like, whew, there goes another one. I hope it doesn't take too long. 10, 15 years really takes you down the hill, But anyway, we'll open up the meeting for open discussion. We got 30, 25 minutes, whatever. If you keep it to 2 or 3 minutes, we should get everybody in who wants to speak. We Agnostics, Chapter 4, Step 2, do you believe in God? Yes or no? God either is everything or he is nothing. There is no middle of the road there. Hey. Is that a question?
Yeah.
I'm I'm told that the 12 steps are all about the individual inverting themselves from from a taker into a giver. That the old alcoholic is a taker, the new alcoholic is a giver, and that's for the individual. And it's the same. It's the same idea for the traditions, that the group is to give of itself and to sacrifice itself for the good of the whole of AA. That the individual is to sacrifice themselves for the good of the community, and that the group is to sacrifice itself for the good of the individual and the community. That's essentially, it's all about self-sacrifice.
Yeah, it took a lot for me to walk through the doors, but it's changed my life.
It's essentially about the people of the group giving up their power and relinquishing their power to this God as we know it.
That's a lot.
And
The first time you start coming, that takes just that, because I admit I'm out of unmanageable. I need help.
yeah.
Because I still thought I was okay. Oh, at 12 o'clock I can meet my girlfriend, and we can have lunch, and we used to joke and cosplay for lunch, and Desperate Housewives. Oh, it was all so fun. Until everyone started getting DUI and in accidents, and everyone started falling apart. I'm not kidding. Then it got really nasty. I'm like, I got to get out of this situation. It was really bad. And then it's the hardest thing, Then there are times when I think, gee, am I going to go buy a bottle of wine today and invite someone over and have some champagne or something? And drink champagne, that's not real alcohol. Oh my God. So many dumb ideas. So, I'm glad to be here.
Hey. Hey, Jacob.
I always celebrate God existed. I am a ministry son, so I always kind of get a smile from every day. And my problem wasn't that God existed. I felt that for a long time that God was up there in that cave, that I was some kind of mistake. I wasn't really sure what it was, but I knew that drinking kind of took that feeling away and made it seem like I was connecting with a higher power for a long time. Drinking was my higher power, but it came with so much destruction and so much chaos, and I didn't see it when I was actively using alcohol. And in the end, it took me going to the hospital, going to an institution, getting bigger acting, going to treatment, and finally realized that there's two ways I could live my life. I could live my life doing it with alcohol, doing it my way, or I could try to live life without alcohol. And since I've started on this path, it's become clear to me that if God exists, not only he does, that his vision for me is to live not alcohol, not drink, beyond the shadow of the doubt that I am alcoholic. It's better, so much better without alcohol. I don't have to worry about lights flashing in the rear view when I'm driving. I don't have to be paying attention to hangover I going to work. I have a relationship with my dad that never was the case for years. All of it, I was struggling, and I've still got a lot of things to learn, and I really appreciate your treatment of these things. There's a lot of wisdom in there. There's ways to understand it. And I'm just trying to do the right thing.
Hey, Dave. Who's next? Hey, Felix. facilitate the reading, we are on the beginning of how it works. What a coincidence. Okay, last week we finished up We Agnostics, and we saw how We Agnostics is a chapter dedicated to saying not that 50% of the first 100 got sober without a God, but those 50% became converts who later found a God deep within themselves, where he says, actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down inside of every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea, and it is only there, in that last analysis, deep down within us, it is only there that he may be found. It was so with us. So that was the end of step 2, in case you hadn't noticed. It was, do you believe in God, yes or no? It's a simple, and you don't have to say yes, but it's important you don't say no. The idea is if you're working with somebody who's a sponsee and they say they don't know whether there is a God, you tell them to be thorough with the remaining steps, and you will get the results. As a result of working those steps, you will come to believe in a power greater than yourself, because in my personal instance, and I wasn't really an agnostic, but I can say that I wasn't sure about faith in God. I believed in God 100%, and it was a God of my own understanding, but I didn't have any faith in that God, that he was taking care of everything. And it was through the process of working the steps that I, in hindsight, look back on it and say, well, something's taking place, and it wasn't me, and there's definitely, how did Bill put it? I couldn't believe that there was an all-knowing, all-powerful creator who was actually concerned with the details of our daily lives, who was actually, that, maybe it was more like there's a God and we're here and we're on our own, that God has no part in what's going on whatsoever. He just made it and stepped back away from it and let it go on its own. But that's not, that God is actually concerned with the actual details of our daily lives. That was something that I had struggled with for years, and I think that many people may also struggle with that same concept, because Bill wrote it in his story there. It's in Bill's story, the man who invented this, or not invented it, but put it together, put the 3 ideas of religion, medicine, and psychiatry together to come up with this program. But here we are at How It Works, and tonight we're going to read a couple of pages. I'll babble and then open the meeting, so you guys are going to have plenty of time to talk. Don't think I'm going to do all the talking. Here in How It Works, this is the beginning of step 3. Step 3 is, roughly, 4 pages? Step 3 is 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, out to 64. So that's like 6 pages there. The top of 64 is the beginning of step 4. And in this third step, I tell you, there's a good place in Bill's story where he explains the third step. So we're going to go back there just to read that one paragraph real quick and get some of the idea of what we're looking at here. Because Bill's story, he's got a really good explanation of the third step in his own life. And I would have to say that mine comes pretty close to that too, that it was alcohol that had brought me to this point too. This is page 13 in Bill's story, and it's only like one paragraph, if that. It's like half a paragraph. Page 13, that's the second paragraph from the top right there, where there I humbly offered myself to God, as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. And that next one kind of begins the step 4, where he says, I ruthlessly faced my sins. And down lower than that, we made a list of people that we had hurt and to whom we'd felt resentment. That's the other half of the 4th step there. But anyway, that idea here that of myself I was nothing, I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction, I humbly offered myself to God. That's about the best explanation, the best description of the third step that I've seen in the book. There's a bunch of them out in the stories too, but Bill's is definitely a little more clear to me anyway. Of course, I've been over it so many times. So when we're reading this, How It Works, we're reading essentially the directions for the third step. And many people don't know that when we're sitting in in the meetings, and we read how it works, and it just goes in one ear and out the other, and we've heard it so many. I heard a guy in here who's been in here like 6 years that I know, who was sitting over there, and he says, I don't know where it says it, but somewhere in the big book it said, we're not saints, that part where he says we're not saints, and I'm going, we just read that like 2 minutes before you raised your hand, and we read it at the beginning of every meeting, so he doesn't even remember where it comes from. And but anyway, that's how complacent I get when they're reading how it works, too. I just kind of like, I'll be thinking about something else completely until we get the meeting going. So how it works, chapter 5, page 58. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. And that's a pretty deep description right there. How many people can you say who come in here who thoroughly follow the path? How many people do come in here and say, that AA doesn't work for me, I must be different, And could it be described that they were working the program thoroughly following the path of this book here? Those who do not recover, okay, so these are the people who don't recover. When we come in here and we see people that aren't making it, people bouncing in and out, who is it that doesn't recover? Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. And that statement we just read out in Bill's story there, that I humbly offered myself to God to build with me and do with me as he would. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. Self-honesty. Now that's the number one form of honesty that we deal with here in the 12 steps is a self-honesty. And if you're going to say that self-honesty and these people that don't make it are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves, then there lies the question, what is it that they're constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves about? And you are brought right to the fourth step where it says that we're looking for what blocks us from God, that selfishness. Here in the third step, he even says that selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our alcoholism. And when somebody opens the book and says, I'll give you an example. I have had a couple of sponsees who I've taken through the steps, and they come back to me and say, I don't have any resentments. And I say, well, then you're supposed to go back into your past and dig some up. I went back into my past. I haven't found any. There's been one or two little things over the years that made me mad, but I'm really not a person of resentments. And that's the first thought in my head was those who do not recover are people who are constitutionally incapable. Meanwhile, their daily life is driven by a resentment, whatever it might have been. So anger, fear, and guilt. I hear some guys who come in here with a lot of time say something about, I don't know about this whole alcoholism is caused by fear thing. I'm not buying into that. And for my first thought is those who do not recover are people. Of course, this is somebody with a lot of time, and then there lies the idea that this person may have been able to stop on a non-spiritual basis. Because I don't know about you guys, but I'm always weighing the pros and cons when I see people who have a lot more than I do, and they do half-ass their program, and I got to dedicate my life to this place. Why do I have to do that? Why can't I come in here once a frickin' month and not sponsor anybody and hit on the women that are coming in and out of here? And how come I can't do that and stay sober? Because I'm comparing apples to oranges in a manner of speaking. You see, not everybody has to dedicate their lives to staying sober and dedicate their lives to coming to AA and helping others, because not everybody had to have a spiritual experience to stop drinking. Some people can still stop when things get bad enough, and those people are in this room too. They come into this room and they hang out, and it does not require that they sacrifice their lives for others, you see. And that's one of the things that confuses the new people, in my opinion. A new guy comes in here, he sees this guy over here, he's working with people all the time, he's always got sponsees, the book, and he's like, man, that guy's working hard at this. I mean, do I have to work that hard to stay sober? Or you see the guy who does nothing, and you go, that's the guy I want. I want to be like the guy who comes in here and half measures it, and they're making a mistake in that not everybody who comes in here is a real alcoholic. Some people are still capable of, when things get real bad, they just stop, but they're still in here with the rest of us. It's not like we got some kind of a test that you got to take, and we say, well, that guy, he's not a real alcoholic. You got to go, man. Nobody does that. But it is important to point stuff like that out. And the people who are unable to, those who do not recover, people who can't completely give themselves to this, are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. And there are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. And when we bring rigorous honesty up again, we're talking about the fear and the anger and the guilt that we have, the things that we've done to others. Remember, when we get out to step 5, one of the main things he points out, he says, we ask if we have omitted anything. When you're in step 6, he says we carefully review the first 5 proposals. Have we omitted anything? And the idea that some people had gone out, and that when they come back in, we go over it with them and say, did you leave anything off of your 4th step? And they say, well, yeah, there was like one thing. It says in the 5th step that they had hung on to some of the worst items in stock. They only thought that they had humbled themselves. And in other words, they weren't completely honest. They are naturally incapable of grasping and demanding or developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. And he's given us like these descriptions of real alcoholics, whereas back in the doctor's opinion and out in the chapter to wives, they give the descriptions of I guess there's 5 types outlined in the doctor's opinion, and one of those is the manic depressive, which is really just a whole other, like this grave emotional and mental disorder thing. And out in the chapter to wives, there's 4 types, and that is the guy who drinks an occasional binge drink, and the guy who's in the gutter and he's been there for years, out to number 4 out there. If you'll read it, Bill gives a pretty good description of the 4 types of alcoholics that we come in contact with. And when he gives those 4 types in the chapter to wives, he actually mentions the fact that the first 2, maybe even the first 3, are still capable of stopping on a non-spiritual basis. That is that worst case scenario guy who absolutely has to have a spiritual experience. There's no other hope for him. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. So this is a reference to the stories out in the back of the book. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. If you have decided that you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. At some of these we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. When I see that, we let go absolutely, what I hear is we let go of the idea that we're in control of our lives anymore. We let go of, we turn in all things to the Father of Light. Let me give you a couple of out here after the 3rd step prayer, he says, this is 63 in the middle of the page here, a couple of pages away from where we were there. We thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to God, to Him. Let's see, there's another one. That would have been back in Bill's story, the other good one where he says, I humbly offered myself to Him. Now, I'm not going to go back to here, but anyway. Remember that we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find Him now. Half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see half measures, that could pertain to any one of or all of the steps ahead that lie ahead here. But to me, half measures pertains to the 3rd step, because these particular pages are dealing with the 3rd step. The beginning of this chapter, how it works, is the beginning of the directions for the 3rd step. And the chapter prior to this was we agnostics was essentially the first part of the 2nd step, and the idea of the sanity that we deal with later on in the earlier chapter of the alcoholic insanity, not the crazy loony bin insanity. That the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous won't help people who are really insane. It's just the insanity that we deal with, that yes, I'll have one drink. Where the hell did that come from? That's alcoholic insanity. You look around the room going, was that some kind of voice in the back of my head? Oh, what do you mean I can have one drink? I don't know about you guys. I never said I could have one drink. I just ended up looking at my hand and finding a beer there and going, what the hell? It's like autopilot or something, like driving my car home in a blackout. I would end up drinking, only I was not in a blackout. Half measures availed us nothing. Now, this is a big one. We stood at the turning point. We stood at the turning point in our lives of, am I going to continue on the path I'm on of drinking and staying sober for a week and drinking and getting sober for a month, off to jail, breaking up with the next girlfriend, losing everything again? Stood at the turning point, and we asked his protection and care with complete abandon. That was the other one I was thinking of there. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon, and until we let go absolutely. Those are pretty powerful statements right there. Complete abandon, not partial abandon. That's one of the things that I've tried with some of the guys that I'm working with, and some of the guys that I really don't work. I got a couple of guys I sort of semi-sponsor. They call me on the phone, and we're not formally sponsee, but it's always AA stuff we're talking about, you know. And this third step is one of the things I always try to return to. Is for me, it was like he says here. I stood at the turning point of my life, and I made a complete decision to surrender my life to God, and that's all there was to it. And he even says in here that the depth of this is, it's hard to explain to somebody else. And the way I put it, and when I say it in a meeting, is my only reason for living from here on out is to serve God. And I got no problem with that now, because what's the option? The option is back out there in the firing line? The hell with that. I mean, I know in here we talk about the firing line of helping people that are in the gutters. You know, that's the firing line we speak of when it comes to helping people. But I was literally at the end of my life, I tell you that. So that's when I see the two choices. And remember back in the chapter, There Is a Solution, I think it was, where he says we had but two alternatives. One was to blot out the consciousness of that intolerable situation as best we could, and the other was to accept spiritual help. And there's only two choices here. So when you come to this third step, the depth of this, we asked his protection and care with complete abandon, is, to me, it's hard to understate something like that. This, in my opinion, is the turning point in my life, and it may very well be the problem that some of these other people that I'm dealing with and that I see other people dealing with and coming in and out of AA are struggling with. I know that I've taken a couple of people through all 12 steps, and they drink again, and they look at me and they go, "What went wrong?" And I said, "Well, let's sit down. Did you leave anything off of your fourth step? If you don't want to tell me, you got to tell somebody, whatever it was." And they say, "No, I cleared everything up." And I go, "Well, just keep that in mind." And then we go back to the third step, and I say, "Are you sure that you asked, that you feel within your heart that your only reason for living from this point on is to serve God, and that you're going to ask his protection and care with complete abandon?" We thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to God. It's not a light statement there. And back here in Bill's story where he says, I'll get quicker at flipping back here in a minute, or I'll start remembering that. That's what I'll do. No, that's a little... Bill's story in the third step he's got back here is, "There I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself that's the sentence I'm going to remember right there. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Half measures availed us nothing." These are all references to this third step and the depth of that third step. And remember not to compare apples with oranges when you see somebody come in here and half-ass the AA program and stay sober for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And you're saying, well, if he can come around here and hang out and do nothing to stay sober, why can't I do that? Because he's not like you and me. For me, there's no other, it's absolute that I am a real alcoholic and there's no other way out. And I tried that for a couple of years. I said, well, and I guess in each every one of us really has to do something of that nature, is to go out and test the water and to see if it, you know, maybe I can do it without that, you know, the level of intense sacrifice that an alcoholic has to. Maybe I can do it without a spiritual experience, but I soon learned different. I cannot. And I had to learn that myself. There was no other way to do it. You could have sat and told me that all day long, and that's what I see with some of the people that I'm working with. And they come back to me and say, you know, you've got some time. What can you do for me? You can help me. And I feel kind of helpless myself. I have to admit, I may have 20 years, but it doesn't mean I know everything. And my first thought is to direct them towards God, towards the third step, and to tell them that, you know, hospitalization is really important. And usually, I don't know if you guys are dealing with people who are in chronic relapse or not, and they're still hanging around. I mean, most people aren't, but the only thing that I can do with them is tell them, don't worry, buddy, help is coming. Help is on the way. Whether it's an ambulance, whether it's the police department and the county jail for 6 months, or whatever it is. They take you to bark detox and they lock you up, and what do they call that when they Baker Act people? I've seen many people get Baker Acted where whoever it is signs and goes, man, you need to hang on to this guy for a while. But anyway, so here are the steps that we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. Remember, every time we see that word "we" in here, because the reason I bring this up, because a guy brought it up to me, and it made perfect sense. And what we're trying to do with this idea is to dispel the idea that getting a group of people's numbers so that you can call on them when you feel like you are going to drink is not the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And many people point to all these we stuff in here. We did this, we did that. And they say, it's a we program together. And somehow, doesn't that take away from the idea that it's you and God? That you need to find a God of your understanding and get in touch with that God. And the only reason you get these people's numbers is maybe you might need some help and direction in the steps, or you might need somebody to help them, somebody that you can be there for. That's what I always say. Yeah, you get all the people's numbers you want to, but you need to invert that whole "I need you" thing. And I know it's a process of learning the steps first, and sometimes I tend to leave that out, but I always say, look, these steps are really simple. They are. It's not complicated. All you need to do is find the right person to explain them to you. And one of my favorite things to say is, if somebody has said something about a step or about AA, about recovery, that has left you confused and wondering what the hell they were talking about, they didn't do it on purpose. Whoever said that was confused and wondering what the hell they're talking about. I used to listen to people in AA meetings and go, I didn't understand a word that guy said. It sounded like just complete nonsense. He made it sound like the recovery program was some sort of ghostly seance type thing in which we all sit and try to contact our dead Aunt so-and-so, Aunt Esther or something, And it just, and that's not the way AA works. And one of the most important things I've seen, I'll open up the floor in just a minute here. The idea that I'm saying about this we program thing is that when you're coming in you're dealing with people who are coming in from the rehabs and the detoxes and the halfway houses, and I don't mean to belittle those people, but many of the people that I came through tend to stray away from the God idea. There's a separation of the medicine area and the religion area, and there seems to be a certain line drawn between them, in which the guys that I was being tutored to by you might call them, they had certifications on the wall that said, we're a certified alcohol counselor. Never said a word to me about God. They always talked about the chemical molecular composition of alcohol's effect on the body, and how the body was some kind of biomechanical device that was influenced by the electrical, and they would do that kind of mechanical stuff, and I'd be like, man, where's the God thing in there, And that somehow there's a misconnection, and that's where that's coming from, that they say, it's a we program, we're a family, we together can. No, you better find God, or the family going to walk away from you when you come stinking and smelling in here after 3 weeks of living behind the dumpster back there. And that's all there is to that. You better find God. And the we program that they speak of is a misconception, in my opinion. And I just try to dispel that when I go to meetings, because many people can look for that easier, softer way in that area of getting people to call, and somehow, if I could just get somebody to listen to my problems, But that's not AA. That was like rehab. And there's nothing wrong with group therapy. I enjoyed pissing and moaning too before I knew what the hell to really do with it. Yeah, that's what I was getting to there. We is found back in the foreword where it says we of Alcoholics Anonymous are the first 100. So whenever you see we in here, you remember that we, the first 100, here are the steps that we, the first 100, took. We, the first 100, admitted we were powerless. And we'll pick up there next week and try to get a couple of more pages in. But remember, we're dealing with the third step and how it works. And most people don't point that out when we're doing that and reading that in the beginning of the meeting or anything. But anyway, we got 30 minutes for open discussion. That's about 5 minutes for each one of you. when we're reading how it works at the beginning of every meeting, we're reading the directions for the third step. At the end of how it works, he says, being convinced we are at step 3. And here in how it works, where he says, we stood at the turning point. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon. That's a description of step 3. And half measures availed us nothing is a reference to half measures at turning your will and your life over to the care of God will avail you nothing. Half measures don't avail you half of turning your will over to the care of God. Half measures avail you nothing. And real quick, just to go back to Bill's story again, and like we're in the third step, and I think one of the best descriptions of step 3 is, Bill being so much better at most of us at putting what he was feeling into words here. On page 13 in Bill's story, like the second page, the second paragraph down the page there, there I humbly offered myself to God. This is Bill Wilson's explanation of how he had experienced step 3. He's in the hospital, too. At the hospital, up like 1.5 pages. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. And there, in the hospital, in his bed there with Abby, he said, there I humbly offered myself to God, as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly. Now, there's a key word right there that we don't see much of out there in the other pages. Unreservedly under his care and direction, I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. And that's Bill's step 3. And now we're going to go back to where we left off here on page 59 at the top. So half measures availed us nothing with this third step. And we stood at the turning point in our lives. This third step is a turning point in which you either go back to drinking or go on with your sobriety. And we asked his protection and care with complete abandon. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And the way I understand that, it's fairly simple. That this idea that my life is unmanageable doesn't mean that in the future, with the help of God and AA, that my life will become manageable again. Because what we're trying to get to here is a complete deflation of the ego, and then upon that completely deflated ego, we can build a new person, a person who is willing to constantly live a life of surrender and ego deflation and self-sacrifice for this God of my understanding. That my life will always be unmanageable. Not from that point on I will start to get management over my life again, but now from this point on I'm going to turn over the management of my life to God, and that this was a requirement of this process that's taking place here. The way I remember hearing Bill and Bob and some of the other literature was a simple question. They would ask you, do you want to stop drinking? There was no breaking the words down into their syllables like I see a lot of people doing today. That people will break down like powerless into the 2 syllables and say, what does power mean? What does less mean? What does powerless mean? And they go into like the dictionary definition of this thing, and they're going they're going further than they need to, in my opinion. They're going a little. For me, this first step was simply something that flashed over me one day. It wasn't like I sat and contemplated it either. I didn't go, is my life unmanageable? Am I powerless? It was just one day alcohol had beaten me so bad. It was more of something that just overcame me. It just that's pretty much where it came from for me. It wasn't a matter of sitting down and. It really, in my experience, the first step was more of a hindsight, looking back on something that had already happened to me. Once I had gotten in here and I had asked somebody for help, it was just simply a matter of looking back and going, yeah, I did that. I don't remember when or how or where, but there was some day I was sitting there and something flashed over me and said, that's it, you're done. And it's over. And then this, like I said, Bill and Bob would the only thing that they would say to the sponsees that they were taking through, because remember, there were thousands. It says Bob had sat at the foot of thousands of alcoholics at that hospital that he was in, at that place where he was working with people, with Sister Ignatia when he left that Akron City Hospital over there. I forget where that other place is. I forget the name of it, but it said that he had worked with some 5,000 alcoholics. So the version of working the first step really amounted, for the most part, to a simple question: do you want to stop drinking? And it really does go straight to the core too, because I mean, I have had a few people in my experience. I have had a few people who say, I'd like to burn a doob every once in a while. It's wrong answer. Wrong answer. The answer is, above everything else, I want to stop. I don't want to touch any of that crap ever again as long as I live. Please, God. That's the answer you're looking for. And a lot of people will be honest about it, too, if you ask them, if you're trying to get to it, And step 2 came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Simple question from Bill and Bob early on: do you believe in God? Do you want to stop drinking? Yes. Do you believe in God? Hopefully, yes. In some cases, I don't know. That's what the whole chapter that we had just gotten through with, We Agnostics, is dedicated to helping me and us, is dedicated to helping us when we're trying to sponsor other people. And you're having a problem with someone who says, I don't know whether there is a God or not. Always go to the chapter, We Agnostics. In that chapter, you will find the answer that you're looking for. Because remember that Bill has 4 years of experience behind him when he wrote this. He wrote this in 39. He got sober in 35. He had 4 years of experience of intensive work with alcoholics, trying to explain to them the 12 steps. And really, essentially, just the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous was a result of their hard work in those first few years of literally dedicating their life to helping others and understand these steps. And most of the experience that I've had with it is like the chapter We Agnostics says, that deep down inside every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of a God. And whether it's a God of their own understanding or whichever God it is they choose, they want to go back to the religion of their childhood or whatever, you leave that up to them. We do not teach what God to believe in. All we teach is how to get in touch with whatever God it is that these people we're trying to work with believe in. And this third step, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of this God as we understood him, is essentially a decision to go on with the rest of the steps. It is through the rest of the steps that the act of turning our will and our lives over to the care of God is through the rest of these steps. And this is only a decision to go on with for me, it was a turning point in my life. It was just like he says up here, half measures availed me nothing. Half measure of turning my life over to the care of God does not avail you half sobriety. It avails you nothing. It avails you, as we put it earlier, untreated alcoholism. We stood at the turning point for me, and apparently for these first 100 who had written this book and had gone over these directions, and reviewed it before it was printed. It was a turning point in their lives, and it was a turning point in my life. So therefore, when I have a sponsee who's having trouble, and we get them through all 12 steps and they relapse, or a lot of the guys I get through 4, 5, 6, and that's when they relapse, when they're out in the application of the spiritual solution steps, and they're not actually doing this, and they relapse during this period. I always bring them, most of these people, if they say they believe in God, or even if they say they don't believe in, don't know whether they believe in God, you still move on with the rest of the steps. You don't stop at step 2 and say, well, we can't go any further. You don't believe in God. You say, well, it's only a matter that you be willing to believe in a power greater than yourself, and you go on with the steps. But I always return these people to this third step because for me it was a turning point in my life. And when I read this literature, when I read this book and all these stories that I have read, I have only read 3 or 4 of them back there. But there are other places where you see stories too, and that is like this other book, Came to Believe. There's a lot of stories in there that people give about how they made a connection with God and some of the depth of this third step and what it means to them. But the depth of this third step, and I'll give you another one. Over here on 63 is the third step prayer, and at the end of the third step prayer, we have, thy love and thy way of life. May I do thy will always, the end of the third step. And this is where he says, we thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to him. Now, abandon ourselves utterly to him is a very deep statement right there. Doesn't say abandon an hour of our day to God, and I'll give you an hour a day for these AA meetings, God, and that's it. I get the other 23, and no, abandon yourself utterly to God, along with half measures availed us nothing, not half measures availed us half sobriety, and we stood at the turning point, and as Bill put it back there, of myself I am nothing, without him I am lost. So having made this decision, as it says in the fourth step, it'll have little permanent effect unless at once followed by these remaining steps. And in these remaining steps, we find the spiritual solutions of forgiveness, faith, and amends, on the premise that anger, fear, and guilt are the three things that block us from this. You make a decision to turn your life over to this God, and now in step 4, one of the things that hung me up was that phrase, moral inventory. We made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Now, this moral inventory, I've heard so many different explanations of it, and I'll tell you one of them I heard recently was a guy had made a reference to, in order to find what a moral inventory is, you must first decide what religion you're going to subscribe to, and then apply to that religion for what their morals are, and therefore you can find what morals it is you're looking for to make an inventory of, which is absolutely crazy because we're given precise directions in here on exactly what to do. And the idea that this moral inventory is anything other than a search for what blocks us from God. And that there are, in the words of this book, there are three things, and they are the most common forms of self that block us from a life of self-sacrifice. Selfishness being the root of our trouble, self-sacrifice being the solution to that. What's keeping me from self-sacrifice is anger, fear, and guilt. So that's all that fourth step is. And how we put that, how I always say is made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves to find anger, fear, and guilt that blocks us from receiving and doing God's will, which is a life of self-sacrifice for others. And number 5, I admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. What wrongs? Self-will for an alcoholic is wrong. God's will is right. Those are like the two opposite ends of this spectrum, self-will and God's will. Self-will is wrong. Whenever you see wrong in here, like out in step 10, he also says, when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. What is it you were admitting? In both of these steps, you were admitting the most common manifestations of self that block me from a life of service and sacrifice for others, which is God's will. So what we're doing here is we're looking to find and apply these spiritual solutions. In step 6, as a result of the first 5 steps, we're entirely ready to have God remove all those defects of character, anger, fear, and guilt, which are the three most common manifestations of self that block us from a life of self-sacrifice for others. 7, you humbly asked him to remove those shortcomings, and each one of these is saying something different, and that threw me when I first got sober, because I didn't get sober around people who were knowledgeable enough to explain to me. It wasn't until I had gotten to, after I had, I think, 8 years of sobriety, and I had went to the Big Book seminar, that I heard those seminar guys say that each one of these is the exact same thing, that the moral inventory, exact nature of your wrong, defects of character, shortcomings, it's all the same thing. The most common manifestations of self that block us from God, or a life of service for others. That is what we do for God. And how we get close to God is what we do for God. So in 7, we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings, and when you actually go through the steps, you'll see that this is primarily has to do with the anger part. That when we're angry, we must be rid of that anger or it kills us, and to get rid of that anger, we apply forgiveness. And forgiveness is one of the main, there is in step 9, there are directions in which it reflects back and says that we ask God to help us with these amends. And also in the fear category, there is an idea in there that says, it's a reference to 6 and 7, where it says we ask God to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be, and that once we commence to outgrow that fear, which is a reference to step 12. We'll get to that when we get out to those pages, though. But oh yeah, 6 is get ready for 7, and 8 is get ready for 9. There's nothing to do but willingness in step 6 and step 8 are acknowledgement steps only. When we get out there, we'll go into further detail. That if you'll look at step 6 in this light, as a result of the first 5 steps, we're entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. And when you read step 6, all he really says is we went home and we were quiet for an hour. We carefully reviewed the first 5 proposals, making sure we did not leave anything out purposely. So 6 is a sort of a precursor or a get ready for step 7, and 8 is a precursor, because if you'll look at step 8, he's saying in a past tense, we already made a list of all persons we had harmed, so all you're doing here is acknowledging that you have this list and that you're willing to make these amends, because if you don't make them, you may very well drink over this. So it's only an acknowledgement. These are acknowledgement steps only. There's no actual work to do. It's sort of a resting point, if you would. A get ready for or an acknowledgement step, a precursor to. And step 9 made these direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Now, except when to do so would injure them or others is an almost, in my opinion, in the way I understand it, is an instruction. If you're going to lie to protect somebody, to keep from hurting them, and I've heard other people say, well, not volunteering the truth, it really isn't lying, and for me, that's splitting hairs. I believe, and I've heard somebody else that I look up to say that if it's to protect somebody, we are instructed to lie, to keep from hurting them. You understand? And I'll give you a couple examples. I think there is an example of a guy who cheats on his wife. It doesn't say this, but I always say he cheated on his wife with his sister, his wife's sister. And, you would destroy the relationship between her and her sister if you tell her that. So you can say, well, I cheated on you and I'll never do it again, but you can't say, I cheated on you and it was your sister. It's over. From that point on, the whole family is like, you've destroyed trying to clear your conscience for something you've done. You have destroyed the lives of 3 people. So you are almost to protect others, except when to do so would injure them or others, is a reference to not volunteering that information. But if you're saying that that's not lying, that's splitting hairs, in my opinion. That's sort of something you do to clear your own conscience. But in my opinion, we are instructed to lie when we are to protect somebody from the pain of what we've done to them. And step 10 is 4 through 9 every day. Continued to take this inventory, and when we were wrong, we promptly admitted it. Remember, the step 5, admitting, I don't really count that as one of the spiritual solutions that we have, but looking back on it, I think I'm going to start adding that to my spiritual solutions list, which is faith and forgiveness when we're angry, making amends when we've harmed others, and faith in God when we're afraid, when our fears dominate us, and admission of these guilts. I'm going to start adding that to. I'm thinking about that right now, and lately, these last few months or a couple of years, making this confession or admission one of the spiritual solutions, because it's absolutely necessary that we admit these things. Forgiveness is the spiritual solution to anger. Making amends is the spiritual solution to harms done others, or the guilt that we feel. Making amends is the spiritual solution to guilt. And faith in God is the spiritual solution to fear. And faith in God is always a reference to step 12. Step 12 is faith in God, like this sign up here. Every time you see this, faith without works is dead, is a reference to step 12. The works of step 12. And all these 11 steps, sole reason for existence is to bring you to step 12. That's the only reason that's their primary purpose. It's what they do. It's their function, is to bring us to step 12. Continue to do steps 4 through 9. And there's another reference to that in step 12 where he says, practice these steps in all our affairs. And when we were wrong, there's that wrong again. Wrong is self-will. Promptly admitting it is a sort of a description of step 5 again, admitted to God. So both in 5 and 10, we have the admitted and wrongs in both of those steps. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact. Now, there's one that I disagree with some people, the idea of sitting in a dark, quiet room and trying to make some conscious contact with the God as you understand him. I understand where people are coming from because they seem to be distanced from, I've heard many people make a reference to a God being out there somewhere, when the way I've experienced it is God is in here somewhere. And God's not out there. He's right here in this room. He's everywhere that there is, actually. God is everything, or he is nothing. God either is or isn't. What's your decision to be is one of the descriptions in back in the chapter 2, Agnostics, the test for the second step we read a couple of weeks back. But in my opinion, prayer and meditation, in my experience, prayer and meditation is talking to God and listening to God. And it says here, it tells us exactly what to say when we're talking to God. It says this is what you're going to say when you pray to God. This is what you're going to do. You're going to pray only for the knowledge of His will for you and the power to carry that out. So half of the step is explained right there. It says that you're going to seek to improve your conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation, and this is what you're going to pray for. So this half of the step is explained here. The other half of the step, meditation, is step 12. It's a question that's imposed, a question that's proposed to God. What do you want me to do? I pray only for the knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry that out, which is, in my opinion, in my experience, implying that I am turning to this God of my understanding, having just done these prior 10 steps and gotten rid of my anger, I've gotten rid of my guilt, and I've gotten rid of my fear, and I've asked God to help me with it, and I've got the details of the steps in there, and we'll get onto them later on as we work our way through these pages. And there's a question posed to God, what do you want me to do? And the answer is step 12. Step 12 is, as you sit in this dark room waiting for the words of God it's in the way I've described it is God does not speak to me. He doesn't talk to me through other people either. What happens is I take my best educated guess at what it is I think God wants me to do. And being that I've just gone through those first 10, 11 steps, I now have the added advantage of being free of what blocks me from what I think God's will is, which is a life of service for others. I've gotten rid of those 4 most common manifestations of self, and then I've directed my attention and said, what do you want me to do, God? Unlike some people have, so I don't have a direct connection with God. Nobody has a direct connection to God. What we do is we take our best educated guess at what it is we think He wants us to do. I don't think He wants us to do crazy things like hurting people and lying and cheating and stealing. I don't think that that's God's will for me. It may be God's will for some people, but not for me. For me, I think God's will is, and it comes to me from being here for a while, is the 12th step. That's the answer to step 11. So how long I always say, how long do you have to sit in a dark room and waiting for the answer to God's will when it's given to us? That the answer to the question in step 11 is step 12. And he says, what happened? He died? Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, that's implying, obviously, that there's something that has happened to us as the result of these steps, and that something is, quite simply, we have learned that anger, fear, and guilt are the primary forms of self, and from those primary forms stem all the sub-forms of self, the smaller forms of self that stem from these, okay? So by bringing these 3 primary forms of self under control, the spiritual solutions that we have, that's the spiritual awakening that's the result of these steps. It's not like you're saying, I used to believe that somehow there was a connection. You know how when people sit around in a seance and they're trying to talk to ghosts, or they're trying to bring up their dead aunt and ask her where she hid all the money or something like that. Whatever it is that people are trying to make this connection to the other world, the people with the cameras running around looking for ghosts and stuff, I thought that somehow there was some kind of connection between me and the spiritual world that was supposed to be taking place here. And my experience with it is not that there's another world that we make a contact with. Everything resides within this world with us, and the spiritual awakening that we're speaking of here is quite simply, I now see that what's been blocking me from the God of my understanding is that I'm thinking about myself all the time. I do not care for other people. And the only people that I care for is the ones that have something to offer me. If something's there for me, those are the people I cared about. And if there was nothing there, then I didn't care about them. So that is the spiritual awakening that is the result of these steps when you go over them the way that they're outlined. The awakening is, you now clearly see what it is. The awakening is the result of the steps. The question remains now, what is the result of those steps? The result of those steps was that anger, fear, and guilt were the primary forms of self, and the 3 spiritual solutions to that. And the application of those solutions is the 12 steps, and that's what's blocking me from God. So, one of the things that I've had, one of the guys I've been working with over the last few years, was he says that this is almost a description that you must have this spiritual awakening before you try to carry this message to alcoholics. Because if you haven't had the spiritual awakening, how are you going to explain it to somebody else? It's almost but that's not what I see. I see, and I'll give you an example. One of the most common examples that I use is that Ebby Thatcher was in the Oxford groups and met Bill, and his whole introduction to the Oxford groups, Bill Wilson's introduction, was from Ebby Thatcher, his boyhood friend, as he calls him, right? So Ebby Thatcher brings the 12 steps, the message, to Bill. Bill has, obviously, he has this spiritual awakening. It's sudden and profound, as he puts it. And Bill never drinks again. Bill stays sober, helps a lot of people, and makes AA, but Ebby Thatcher drinks. So Ebby Thatcher didn't have, obviously he had not had the spiritual awakening that kept him sober from that point on. So you can say that from one of the most profound descriptions that we have, that you don't have to wait to have a spiritual awakening. If someone's sitting there going, I really don't think that I've had a spiritual awakening, therefore I'm not qualified to try to explain that process to another human being. You understand? And that's what many people are saying to themselves, and they're putting themselves in a catch-22 position in which they can't help others till they have a spiritual awakening, and guess what? They're not going to have a spiritual awakening until they start helping others. You understand that? That it really is a very simple idea that through the process of working these 12 steps, that the spiritual awakening, it may take years to set in. It may take, at no point does some of us who have the gradual educated variety, which they say is 90% of the spiritual awakening, do one day we just wake up and go, wow, there it is. It was on 12:02 p.m. on Saturday that I had my spiritual awakening. It's just over the period of a couple of years, you look back and go, well, something's happened because I've got a whole new attitude and outlook upon my life. I have definitely changed my point of view here. And it wasn't one particular day or a certain time on which you said that was the day that it happened and that was the time that it happened. So therefore, when you're coming across this idea that you cannot carry the message of having a spiritual awakening if you haven't had one, I believe it can be dispelled simply by looking at Ebby Thatcher and Bill Wilson, two of the most common people we talk about in recovery. Dr. Bob, Bill obviously, but Bill wouldn't have got sober without Ebby, and Ebby drank, and then Bill sponsored Ebby, as from what I heard. I don't know for sure, but I heard that after Ebby Thatcher drank, he came back and Bill helped him out. Anyway, we'll open up the floor for open discussion, and next week we'll pick up where many of us exclaimed, "What an order!" and we'll go into some more of the third step here.